So let me introduce to you now our panel moderator. This is Dr. George Ganatos from the Department of Economics at Sacramento State University. You'll be in charge of today's panel. So,
thank you.
Let's begin.
I was going to give sorry about that. I was going to give a little forward regarding the Greek economy during this time period, but I think it might be better to wait until the next speaker, Dr. Katridis. I'll introduce our speaker currently, Alexandros Nafpliotis. He holds a PhD in international history from the London School of Economics and Political Science. He studied English language and literature at the University of Athens and history and international relations at the London School. He is currently a research associate at the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy. He was previously a research associate at the National Hellenic Research Foundation, a visiting fellow at the Hellenic Observatory at London School of Economics, and has also worked as an attaché at the High Commission of the Republic of Cyprus in the United Kingdom, as well as for the Army History Directorate in Greece. His first book, Britain and the Greek Colonels Accommodating the Junta in the Cold War, examines diplomatic, economic, cultural, and defense relations between subsequent British governments and the junta. He has presented his research at conferences and seminars in Europe and the United States and has won a dissertation prize from the London Hellenic Society. Alexandros has taught on various aspects of 20th century international history at the London School of Economics for a number of years. His research interests lie in the field of contemporary European history, so we welcome him.
I would like to start by thanking the organizers, the host and the co-host, Andrea Limatos, and especially Katerina Lagos, for the invitation and the wonderful opportunity of coming here to Sacramento and talking about my research on the junta, a subject on which I've been working for 14 years now. I find that quite embarrassing, especially when I'm talking to medieval historians or ancient historians. And I tell them that I work on a 7-year period. I've been working on that period for 14 years. But there you go. There you have it. So it's a subject that I've been working on for quite some time. But it's also I've also had a personal interest in this period. I'm a child of the dictatorship in a way, and I'll explain myself. You see, my parents met during the junta in January 1973, and quite typically for a Greek couple at the time, they decided to get married a few months later. So in November 1973, they got married on the first day of the Athens Polytechnic uprising in November. So the wedding album was filled with photographs of tanks rolling down the streets of Athens. So that was the fact that actually sparked my interest in working on the junta. Just a personal note. So today I'm talking about Britain, Europe, and the Greek Junta. And I'll start off by making two very short points. The first one has to do with putting this paper in broader context of my research project, which concentrates on Europe and Greece, Greece and Europe, in an effort to contribute to a better understanding of Greece's long-lasting love-hate relationship with Europe, which is highly topical, as of course you all know. But also, I think more importantly, is a significant part of Greek identity. So in this respect, I'm also presenting a paper on Western Europe and the junta in a conference in Athens in June, and a paper on PASOK, the Greek Socialist Party, and European integration, the whole "we belong to the West" or "Greece belongs to Greeks" the issue. I'm presenting that paper at the MGSA in November in New Jersey. And brief methodological note. This is a work in progress. It's a combination of old research based on the research I did for my first book on Britain and the Greek colonels. And it's also based on new research on official documents from a variety of countries like the UK, the US, Greece itself, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, among others. So the points I want to make today have to do with examining the relationship between Western European countries and the junta. My emphasis is going to be on Britain, but I'm also going to talk about other countries as well. So I'm going to do that by looking at the European dimension of this relationship. And by that I mean the actions of specific Western European countries like Britain, France, and Germany, vis-à-vis Greece within the framework of regional international organizations such as the Council of Europe, NATO, and European communities, which were all founded in the late 1940s, early 1950s. I'm going to try and explain what I have named, my term is the doctrine of disconnected responsibilities. I'm going to explain that. And then I'm going to briefly talk about the Europeanization, as I call it, of UK policy towards the junta. Finally, I'm going to try to attempt a comparison with French and West German policies. And if I have time, I know this is highly ambitious, but if I have time, I might just refer to the policies of the other EEC member states at the time, which were Italy and the Benelux countries. So to start off, I'm going to give you a short introduction on UK policy towards the junta. There were two governments in Britain during the dictatorship. The first one was a Labour government from 1967 to 1970, and the second one was a Conservative government from 1970 to 1974. British governments at the time were in a very weak position financially and internationally, and therefore had to follow pragmatic policies that were meant to prove Britain's subordination to NATO and American interests. The Labour government, after initial numbness, went out of its way to establish a good working relationship with the regime that would permit the regime to continue working, that would permit Britain to work with the government in Athens. So, this picture of ambiguity was completed by the differences between the British government's rhetoric and actions, as for example, providing Greece with arms and condoning it within the framework of NATO, while at the same time Labour ministers openly criticised the junta's methods and urged it towards a return to constitutional rule in forums such as the Council of Europe. Prime Minister Wilson, as much as he disliked them, did not cut off relations with the colonels. He recognised them, he kept trading with them, thus promoting a policy of business as usual, but stopping short of unapologetically conducting warm relations with them and fulfilling all their demands. It was only after Labour returned to power in March 1974, when, due to their political orientation and the absence of I'm going to talk about the Conservatives now, and then I'm going to come back to the Wilson government in 1974. The Conservatives came to power in June 1970, and due to their political orientation and the absence of a left wing, they appeared more realistic, following a pragmatic policy par excellence. So they concentrated on Greece's allegiance to the Atlantic Alliance, continuing and strengthening a good working relationship with the regime, including actively promoting trade and maintaining peace in Cyprus. To achieve this, cooperation in all fields, and most importantly defence, was pursued, with visits on both sides serving the purpose of bringing London closer to Athens. The main objectives of policy towards Greece were changed to reflect a new spirit in relations, whereby the government in London would not twist the junta's arm over a return to constitutional rule and democratic liberties. The Conservatives followed the doctrine of disconnected responsibilities, and I'm going to come back to this in a minute, which was introduced earlier by the Labour government, making clear that the NATO and the Council of Europe contexts were completely different and separate, and that developments in one context could not spill over onto the other one. However, the familiar tightrope act of Britain's relations with the junta was also obvious under Heath, Prime Minister from 1970 to 1974, insofar as trade figures almost doubled and relations became warmer, but the British also failed to provide sufficient encouragement to the Marquesines experiment in 1973, and were also constrained by their participation in the European integration process, another point which I'm going to come to in a few minutes. Basically I'm going to try to illustrate UK's and other EEC member states' policy through actions within regional organisations. The Council of Europe versus NATO issue, which I see as two sides of the same coin, and the European integration process, the European economic communities at the time. The reason I'm interested in this is the fact that it was a European coup d'etat, as I see it, the Greek one. Greece was connected with institutions that framed the European integration process at the time, and this led to a consideration of political criteria the members of a regional organization should respect. And the coup d'etat also led to a discussion about European economic community's political identity. For the EEC, the establishment of the dictatorship in Greece confirmed the necessity to set a political conditionality vis-à-vis relations with other European countries. So, we'll start off talking about the Council of Europe, then I'm going to move on to NATO, Europe integration, and then on my final conclusion. For those of you who don't know, in September 1967, a few months after the coup d'etat, under severe pressure from their parliaments and from street protests, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and the Netherlands demanded that the Council of Europe take action against Greece over its breach of Article 33 of the European Convention on Human Rights. And Greece was to be the very first instance where an interstate complaint against another member was to be investigated so thoroughly and a ruling to be made. By late 1969, Greece was forced to withdraw from the Council of Europe, and that was the second international setback the junta suffered after the freezing of the EC agreement in 1967. What was the stance of the British at the time concerning this issue? British diplomats immediately stressed the importance of not getting drawn into unnecessarily provocative action by the Scandinavians, as they called it. The Greek ambassador in London, Verikios, told British officials that the junta's tolerance cannot be sustained in view of malevolent and one-sided stance of people in Strasbourg, where the Council of Europe is based. That has caused general and uncontrollable indignation in Greece, where everyone, according to Verikios, was asking for a withdrawal from this instrument of anti-Greek campaign, as he called the Council of Europe. What was the advice of the Foreign Office? The Foreign Office initially said that it was absolutely against Greek withdrawal. That's one thing. The second one thing was that the British would try to avoid any discussion at governmental level, and if not successful, number three, they would try to bury the issue at the Council of Ministers. In 1969, the UK government did not want to assume, though, any initiative, and its final stance would in any case depend on consultations with governments of allied countries. Junta thought that the UK had not yet formed a clear position on the Greek expulsion from the Council of Europe, and decided to provide information to, first of all, persuade the UK, and second of all, more importantly, to help the UK intervene in other countries, unofficially assuming thus the role of a mediator. And that's exactly what Britain did at the time. Note here, though, that similar efforts were made from France and the Federal Republic of Germany, efforts to influence other member states of the Council of Europe in order to avoid an open condemnation of the regime. And that's even though the fact that that was even though there was a Labour government in the UK, and the Socialist Party had just assumed power in Germany, in West Germany. However, the UK position changed in October 1969 due to public opinion and parliamentary pressure. The UK was now in favour of avoiding a vote and having Greece withdraw. As the Foreign Secretary Stewart said at the time, he told the Greek officials that even big powers like Britain and France over Suez and USA over Vietnam are obliged to take into consideration public opinion in their countries, as well as advice and pressure from other friendly and allied countries. And speaking of allied countries, it soon became clear that the US was not pleased. In 1970, the new US ambassador in Greece, Henry Tasca, said that Labour's attitude to the Greek government was mistaken, and the part which the British government had played in the Council of Europe's decision had been mistaken and even irresponsible. The Federal Republic of Germany nevertheless agreed with the UK and underlined the opportunity to draw a clear distinction between the Council of Europe and NATO. So this again brings us to the doctrine of disconnected responsibilities, as I call it. The French position was much easier given the fact that France was not part of the European Convention on Human Rights at the time. However, it should be said that France recognized that the position of Willy Brandt, the leader in West Germany, was key. Italy was the closest to the Scandinavians' point of view, but was more reserved as it was interested in coordinating its actions with the British government in order to reach a common position. And just a short note on the Benelux countries. They all had parallel positions, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The Netherlands hesitated initially. They would have preferred a joint Benelux action. They closely cooperated with Scandinavians, that is, the Danes, the Swedes, and the Norwegians. So they cooperated with them in submitting the application to the Council of Europe. They soon submitted a similar application, and Belgium and Luxembourg expressed their sympathy with that application, even though the UK thought that was an ineffective way of bringing pressure on the junta. But then the Dutch followed a more cautious approach, also stressing the importance of not linking the case at the Council of Europe to Greek membership of NATO. In Belgium, there was extreme critical reactions in Parliament from the very beginning, asking for a break in diplomatic relations with Greece. But they also stressed the events in the Middle East, and that's the Six-Day War, which came almost 40 days after the Greek coup d'etat. Those events helped get the Greek issue out of sight a little bit. And in relation to the Council of Europe resolution, the Belgians thought that it was better to appease, wait for events to become clear, and give the Greek government the chance to fulfill its promises. The case of Luxembourg is particularly interesting, as the Greek embassy expressed the desire to see Luxembourg intervene with representatives of Luxembourg in the Parliament, in the Council of Europe, to make them declare their opposition to a recommendation for Greek suspension. And that was a tactic that the junta used with other small countries as well. For example, the Greek ambassador in Switzerland demanded with insistence that Switzerland adopted a moderating attitude that would allow the progression of the procedure. So all in all, we can say that the foreign policy of Council of Europe member states was shaped by individual foreign policy considerations, among which security considerations prevailed due to the institutional design of the Council of Europe. And this is clearly explained by the next issue, which is the NATO context. And to explain that, I have to talk a little bit about the arms policy of the UK and other countries. Britain thought that it should in principle permit the supply to Greece of arms, which Greece could reasonably be expected to require in order to fulfill its obligations within the NATO context. And that only the supply of those arms intended to repress the civilian population should be prohibited. That was the official UK policy. An agreement with major allies in NATO was attempted by the British, first when contacting the United States, but that had no effect. And the main reason was that the US policy on arms supply was the exact opposite of that of the UK. That is that whereas the British, as a matter of principle, did not provide the colonels with material that could facilitate them suppressing civilians like small arms or grenades, the Americans, on the other hand, traditional suppliers of weaponry to Greece, had chosen to terminate the delivery of items of high visibility, as they called them, like tanks and airplanes only. The Foreign Office at the time had two major fears, and those were, first of all, that if their country did not supply that kind of military equipment, its policy objectives would be placed in jeopardy, because they would no longer be able to exercise the influence with the Greek government required to pursue the objectives. And the second reason was that the UK's allies would rush to cash in. That was the second British fear. Other countries like the US had already signed contracts, the US for aircraft and minesweepers, French for patrol boats, and the Germans for submarines. So the UK's poor economic condition made it exceedingly difficult to defend putting at risk export orders to Greece. And we should note here that there were similar concerns in France as well, and those were voiced in the context of COREPER. COREPER is the Council of Representatives Council of Permanent Representatives in the European Economic Communities. So within that context, the French representative said that we should really do something not to lose out to other less scrupulous countries. So the French had the same fears that the British had. The Prime Minister Wilson asked to be informed on a regular basis on the American position on arms supplies. His point being that the United Kingdom should not appear to give more support to the Greek regime, even in the NATO context, than the United States. And at the same meeting, another major distinction in relation to the British government's stance vis-à-vis the Greek Junta was drawn. It was decided that actions to assist the defense of NATO and the British attitude towards Greece in the Council of Europe were two completely different and loosely related issues. And I have a quote here, it's a bit long, but bear with me. According to FCO officials, Foreign Office officials, our policies in the Council of Europe should be decided in the light of the moral and other issues involved, while questions of military cooperation should be treated in the NATO context. This distinction reflects the fact that whereas the Council of Europe has a democratic statute, which its members are committed to observe, NATO is the product of a military alliance. If a government is clearly in violation of the statute of the Council of Europe, a time must come when it can no longer be accepted as a member. but we remain firmly opposed to action against Greece in NATO, in which Greece occupies a key position on the southeastern flank. Any attempt to interfere with Greek participation in NATO would be strongly opposed by, among others, the United States, German and Turkish governments, and would have a politically divisive effect within the alliance, in addition to its military implications. But it shows you the way that British officials were thinking at the time vis-à-vis the Greek Junta. However, the British government, in an effort to palliate parliamentary criticism, chose to subscribe to the move to suspend Greece's membership of the Council of Europe, and at the exact same time reassured the colonels and the Americans that it would safeguard Greece's position in NATO. And in this respect, Wilson's decision to sacrifice Greece's presence in a political organization of lesser significance was designed to function as a safety valve for the automatic release of parliamentary and of public opinion pressure when the temperature on the Greek case exceeded the limits. Moving on to the Conservative government, which came to power in 1970, the Conservatives immediately proclaimed that they had not been in full agreement with the way the previous government had handled the proceedings of Greece in the Council of Europe. The new Greek ambassador in London, Sorokos, said that the UK should remind partners who forget their general responsibilities, like Denmark, that it is not possible to refer to issues of domestic politics. His British counterparts agreed and said that the Danish stance on many points was curious and kept creating problems for them. And he said that the UK would make efforts through the NATO General Secretariat, with which UK was in contact, to promote issues. That the UK would make efforts to detach Norway from Denmark and have Norway exert pressure on Denmark. And the third and most important point, I think, is the fact that they said that the British ambassador in Denmark, in Copenhagen, he had a plan to get even Turkey involved in the issue and exert pressure on Denmark too. And this was a consideration. This was an issue which was under examination of the Foreign Office at the time. In the next NATO meeting in September 1970, NATO, the role of Greece was the first item on the agenda. The British said that if in future the Scandinavians spoke in NATO against the Greeks, the British delegation should be prepared to underline the value of the Greek contribution to the alliance. And the British government justified this position by claiming yet again that discussion of Greek internal affairs would have a divisive effect within the alliance. And we should keep in mind that NATO was, at the time, one place where Britain demonstrated its continuing importance to the United States, countering the negative effect of the withdrawal from east of Suez and Wilson's refusal to send troops to Vietnam, just to put this in a general Cold War context. In the meantime, Britain's position in NATO had been reinforced by a new era in the junta's relations with the United States, which was triggered by international events in the region, such as the evacuation of the US Air Force in Libya after Colonel Gaddafi's coup, and the rise of anti-American feeling in Turkey. And this new relationship was also sealed with the appointment of a new US ambassador in Athens. The UK fear at the time was that attempts by the Danes, the Norwegians, and the Dutch again to discuss the internal situation in Greece, or even to question the membership of the alliance, might prompt a Greek walkout. And this risk had been aggravated by the death of Foreign Minister Pipinelis in 1970, and by the increasing influence of the hardliners in Athens. So the first quid pro quo that the British actually proposed to the Greek government was the British support for an allocation of NATO funds to Greece for British use of facilities in Crete. That was solidified in the next NATO Council, which revealed the priorities and the anxieties of not only the British but also the other Europeans. Attacks by the so-called usual suspects, that is the Scandinavians, were now received much more philosophically in Athens. And the reason for that was that the junta regime felt much more great confidence regarding its position in NATO, and that reflected the development of the United States and British policy regarding defense cooperation with Greece during 1970. So the doctrine of separated or disconnected responsibilities served the British government very well, as it provided it with a defensive line in face of criticism from both European and British liberals and the colonels. So I'm just going to briefly talk about. How much time do you have? Okay, I'm just going to move on to the French policy very briefly. On the 25th of March 1971, that was the 150th anniversary of Greek independence. It was a huge parade in Athens, military parade, and many French AMX 30 tanks. The British Foreign Secretary at the time, Sir Alec Douglas Hugh, saw the pictures in the papers, and he said that I have also read in today's Times of the sale of the latest French tanks to Greece. And his suggestion was, I think we're handicapping ourselves too much, and we should go out for business with them, particularly in the air and naval fields. The French had followed the policy of non-interference in the domestic affairs of Greece, and relations with Greece were particularly good. There was a connection established with Palamas, the successor of Pipinellis as foreign minister of Greece. And a watershed in that respect was the visit of Delipovsky. He was the first minister from a Western European democracy on an official visit to Greece. There was emphasis put on increasingly improving economic relations, and that actually got the British thinking and led to the first official visit to Greece by a British minister, Lord Limerick, in 1972. He was responsible for trade and industry in London. West Germany kept a similar stance, although being a little bit more prudent. And I should also stress here that the US also shared the British fear of junta going French, as he said. So I'm just quickly going to move on to the issue of Europeanization, and then I just conclude. Yeah? Okay, thank you. So why do I talk about the Europeanization of UK policy towards the junta? First of all, the prominence of the question of the EC, the foreign policy of Britain, was quite obvious to the Greek side, to the colonels. The person involved with the Prime Minister Heath in this process, as well as the loosening of the special relationship with the United States, was acknowledged by the Greeks, who were also worried about developments in the EC and their future in Europe in general. The British, in turn, acknowledged the Greeks' anxiety over the working of their association agreement with the EC that had started in 1961. It had been frozen in 1967, as I said before. And that was bound to have repercussions on the relation between Athens and London as well. More specifically, the Foreign Office had the impression that the EC Commission was likely to persist in its hostile attitude against Greece. As a consequence of that, FCO officials noted that the Greeks are already looking for support, and on achieving full membership, we must expect further pressure from them. The UK was, let me remind you that the UK was going to be an ECU member state in January 1973. The British, however, thought that there was little they could do, especially as Denmark and Norway, two of Greece's main European critics, were supposed to be joining at the same time. Difficulties presented on the relation between Athens and Brussels were far more complex than the discussion of the Greek issue in the NATO forum. And that, in conjunction with the precarious state of the British within the regional organization, remember that they were not an important founding member of the EC, as was the case in NATO, and the British had been declined entry on 2 occasions. So that meant that London was not that keen on taking up the Greek cause within that context of the EC. However, Britain's accession to the community did inevitably bring the British into a new relationship with Greece. In terms of commercial dividends, it was asserted by the British that if we were to give the present Greek regime overt political support in the EC, we might expect to get over a period of time a share of the civilian public contracts. The commercial dividends were extremely significant, as Whitehall, the British government that is, was particularly worried about Britain's sliding position in the Greek list of foreign trade and about the success of its rivals. And it should be noted here that comparable British figures for investment and credits were expected to be little above a tenth of the French level. You see the difference then. The British ambassador in Athens suggested taking the French line of conducting contacts discreetly and with tact. And on the issue of the colonel's proposed quid pro quo, this is the one that the colonels proposed this time, whereby they would award contracts in the public sector for a more favorable attitude from EC member states, including the British. London was slightly apprehensive, but largely accommodating. The example of Greek wine exports to the EC is quite telling. The UK representative at the EC expressed himself in favour of the compromise proposals the Greeks were prepared to accept, and the British, who however had only a slight direct interest in the subject, in view of the very small consumption of Greek wine in Britain, they were expected to be able to support the Greeks in the Council of Ministers as well. So this is only an example of how the British helped the junta within that context. However, the British realized that Athens had exaggerated expectations as regarded progress in Greece-EC relations. There was intense domestic criticism, especially after May 1973 and the arrest of Pesmazoglou, who was the chief negotiator with the EC before the junta. And I'm just going to mention some clear examples of Europeanization of UK's foreign policy, then I'm going to conclude. The first one was the abolition of monarchy, which followed in 1973, and the subsequent recognition issue. This time Britain paid particular attention to its European friends, as it was now a member of the EC, and that this process was institutionalized in a forum different than NATO. More specifically, Foreign Secretary Douglas Hume informed the embassy in Athens that ministers had directed that no decision on recognition should be taken prior to consultation with Britain's partners. The same thing happened, meaning the coordination of views between Britain and the other countries. Same thing happened with the reaction to the 1973 referendum on the Constitution, and with the reception of Marquezini's government and the issue of recognition again in late 1973. After recognition, the UK adopted a policy of wait and see. However, during the Marquezini's experiment, Britain's attitude, the helpful and sympathetic attitude towards Greece in the EC context, was reaffirmed. When the Ioannidis regime came to power, of course, things changed. British were much more apprehensive. Just a note on the Greek Junta. Because I've talked a lot. I've said a few things about Britain and the other European countries. I'm just going to have a small note on the way Junta viewed its relationship with Europe, and then I'm going to conclude. Okay. At the same time, the Greek colonels were willing to pull out all the stops to reassure Western Bloc countries of Greece's belief in and allegiance to the Western Alliance, and NATO in particular. Numerous efforts were made to convince Westerners, especially those like the British, who were not constantly condemning the regime, that no change in Greece's foreign policy orientation was forthcoming. At the same time, they appointed former generals to be Greek ambassadors in London and Paris. They went forward with a rapprochement with Greece, especially after 1970. And there's a very brief quote here from Palamas, the Greek alternate foreign minister here, which actually encapsulates the very spirit of Greek foreign policy and Greek officials' perception of foreign relations at the time. He said that since Greece has left the Council of Europe, bilateral relations with its members had improved. This showed that governments were really interested in their own relations with Greece, not in general democratic ideals and principles. So there was a basic difference of approach between the British, whose objectives were primarily commercial and concerned mainly with bilateral trade, and the Greeks, whose objectives were predominantly to secure UK support and after it entered the EC in achieving junta's aims in that context. So to conclude, Greece's efficiency as a NATO ally was the most marked and publicized objective of the British government vis-à-vis the Greek colonies. It is unambiguous that the British condoned the junta in NATO, despite severe criticism from other members of the alliance. Both Labour and Conservatives struggled to convince critics at home and abroad of the necessity to recognise the regime. This bipartisan recognition of the junta is obvious in the careful handling of the Greek issue in the aftermath of Greece's withdrawal from the Council of Europe, so that it did not spill over into NATO. In the doctrine of disconnected responsibilities, introduced by Labour and followed by the Conservatives as well, and in the general stance of the British in relation to condemning the Greeks in the forum of the Atlantic Alliance. In relation to the European Economic Community, London was hoping to extract some advantage from its helpful to the Greeks' attitude by initiating a quid pro quo with the junta, whereby the British would be awarded contracts in the public sector or an exchange of a more favourable attitude towards Greece in the regional organisation. The prospect of Britain's membership of the European Economic Community functioned as a trump card in the hands of the British, who, although not very capable of acting in favor of the colonels within the regional organization, could also use it as leverage to push the Greek leadership towards a more liberal direction, crucially without assuming sole responsibility for that initiative and without taking the heat alone. It was through the use of such tactics that the British government could revert to its familiar tightrope act in pursuing its objectives towards Greece under military dictatorship. As far as the other countries were concerned, I would just like to mention four important factors as I see them. Two of them are quite well known, the other two not so much. The first one was the American factor in the wider context of the Cold War, especially NATO, which influenced a lot of the politics that various European countries followed at the time. The second one was the role of public opinion, which is especially interesting and especially important in some instances, like for example, the Danes, Swedes, and the Dutch. This usually went hand in hand with the political orientation of the government in power, but not always. An obvious example was the Conservative government in Norway. The third factor is which is not so, it's a bit understudied I think, is specific national interests. Like for example, the Danes' main consideration as far as the Junta was concerned was the connection with the royal connection between the Greek and the Danish royal family. For Norway, where there was the issue of providing arms to the regime.
Yes.
For
Speedboats.
speedboats,
Yes.
torpedo boats. And the fourth factor is competition, as I tried to illustrate in my speech, competition between Western European countries. Like for example, the fear, the anxiety that the British felt over increasing French and German influence in Junta. Thank you.